Welcome back to the Orca Boat Shop, and my name's Rod. So this is episode 4 on building the Black Pearl Greenland kayak. Now that the hull is done, I can roll it over. I'm going to set it up here on some stands, on wheels, be able to move it about the shop and begin building the deck. So that's going to be this episode. So stick around and see how this takes place. For the first strip on the deck of the Black Pearl, I've got a strip laid down, just temporarily clamped to the shear guard or shear clamp in there. Give me an idea of how long it needs to be. We know the end of the boat's going to come to here and it'll be rounded over. But for this to take, this kind of curve in here, and how am I going to hold it in together? I figured the best way is for me to taper this down a little bit to half the distance of where the end of the boat will sit. One, it'll be a little bit easier to bend, and then it'll butt up to the other piece coming in here. Then I can run a second piece in and then start working down the center line, I think. I mean, that's a bit of a bend in there, but it's going to be hot glued down. And another option would be to run what we call a king plank, one plank or two even, straight down the center line, and then have these pieces come up to it. Weigh that option when we see how much this has to bend. I mean, I can add some heat to it. Anyways, we'll get the other side and other end fit, and then we'll see how that works. I have my two shear strips, or what we call covering boards, which are going to run down the perimeter of both sides, and I've actually cut a couple of other ones that I'm going to try and get down the center to hold everything together at the ends, and glue that in and tape it down. The covering board will get glued to the shear clamp via epoxy. So I have actually added another layer of tape, packing tape to the outside edge here, because heaven forbid that if I get glue in here and this gets taped to the first shear plank on the hull, that's going to be a big problem. So it's not going to take much, just a thin coat. I have thickened it a little bit. It's sort of heavy, heavy cream consistency. And just using a small acid brush to apply. I'm going to try and avoid applying too much near the forms because anything squeezes out. And glue. I mean, those will probably get knocked out, no problem, but what's going on here? Packing tape is folding back. Stick down there. If you go back to episode 1 in this playlist, you will see that I went why I put that, or this shear clamp in. The deck will get glued to it permanently, and when I remove the deck, the shear clamp should, if all has gone well, should come out with it. Then when deck and hull are finished, we glue the deck to the hull at the shear clamp. Should be enough. Now at the ends, I'm just going to hot glue the shear strip or cover board to the hull strip, whereby I can then remove it later by cutting through the hot glue. That means removing the packing tape in that area. And smart to put some reference line on here to where this strip is supposed to sit. That's the beauty of working with epoxy as the glue. You have a lot of time to move and adjust things prior to glue setting up. I work my way down, I'm just readjusting and adding clamps so that the outside edge of this strip is flush with the hull on the outside. I'm going to take a few clamps to hold it in place. It is kind of being edge set as it goes around the curvature of the hull. So, probably best that it overhangs a little more than not enough. You can always trim it off. Of course, the only disadvantage of the epoxy is I won't be able to do much until tomorrow on fitting any more planks. So I'm just going to work my way along here and make minor adjustments, push it out for the most part. Now that I have the two cover boards glued down with the epoxy, I'm just going to start working from the center line out. I'm actually going to run this one strip with a taper on both sides to just sort of wedge right between those two up the center line at the bow and the stern. The planks don't need to go all the way from bow to stern because it's broken up by the open cockpit area. And again, you'll notice right here that those two coverboard planks are not going right to the very end, but the stem and the first shear strips on the hull are actually a little bit longer than necessary. We're still going with stapleless construction, so lots of clamps, lots of jigs to hold it in place, and then we'll hot glue it down and sight down from bow to stern to make sure that the two strips are down the center line. With that center strip in place, I'm going to start building my way out from center line out to shear. Can usually put in two strips on either end at the same time and just clamp them together, jig them up with the C-clamps and the little jigs on the forms themselves. I'm only going to be able to use these pony type clamps for a little bit because they just don't extend or open wide enough, but quick grips, definitely able to pull everything and get some glue squeezing out. As I plank the deck fore and aft, at some point in time I'm going to have to join these two, and it's looking like somewhere in this area here where the strips will continue through the forms and join up. There's going to be quite a bit of a twist, which I've been able to do on this strip down the shear line here. The question is, at what point do I start to lift these strips up towards that point there? Because the plans basically show that it is flat right up until and almost station number 7, and that's station number 7 right there. So what is the transition going to look like? I think at this point in time I am going to start to at least lift this up a little bit here and glue it, not fully. Maybe I need to put some sort of bracing just clamped underneath here or screwed underneath there to just kind of hold this up so that I can get the transition between the foredeck and the aft deck behind the cockpit, because it really is going to be tricky to get these to twist around. The next strip theoretically should go from the foredeck right through to the aft portion of the aft deck here. That's going to be joined to this strip here. So let's see how we can manage that. If I can lift up a little bit and hold this together. I just don't really want it lifting off of station number 8, that's for sure, because then we get too much of a slope through that portion. So is that going to hold it there? Not quite. So yeah, we're going to need something under here. So I think what I'll do is I'll cut a scrap piece of ash to go across here and screw it in through the front portion, or the fore portion of the station number 7. So let's say we make it about yay long. I think it's going to be long enough that I can get a clamp on this end, pull it up, and on the other end, down. So this portion of the deck was a little bit tricky. I had to use a bunch of shear quick grips to kind of pull everything together super tight, trying at the same time to lift up that stern portion of the deck. To align some of the strips, I'm just putting some C-clamps kind of across the joint. Otherwise, the center section wants to drop down too much. We shall let that set up for a good long while so that glue joint doesn't come undone. We'll work on the foredeck. And then one more piece up here, and then the rest will run fully, completely from fore to aft. Now, to make sure that I actually do have the cockpit area covered, I'm making a little pattern from the plans, kind of lofting it out, marking it, using a batten to draw the curves. And then it's just a half pattern, and with that piece of paper I can lay it down on the deck and make sure that planking is going to cover where the cockpit will eventually be. With the cockpit pattern in hand, I brought it over to the boat and I have laid it down across the center line and extending sort of where it's to be located. And then I have marked on the forms where I needed to plank to make sure that planking is going to extend into the cockpit. Now there certainly was a few tricky areas in getting these strips to come down through here, twist, and then come back and lay flat across the stern portion of the deck. I am going to need to put a couple of slivers into these areas here because there's a larger circumference here than there is here, so it takes more lumber to fill the area aft of the cockpit opening. I also had to use a bit of epoxy in some areas here because even with the wood glue clamped well in place, it did want to come apart as I started to twist it and force it down and into place. Therefore, well, that's a little bit of scraping, but that's certainly a much stronger glue bond. This side came out a little better than the starboard side in that this one strip here is raised up quite a bit. It's loose, I can get it to go back down. So I'm going to get a little more epoxy into that slot while I shove some slivers into these two areas here and bring it down. I can cut off this strip here so that the foredeck can come down a little bit. It is quite a transition between the foredeck here and the aft portion of the cockpit here. And once I get those two little areas dialed in with a couple of slivers and the strips glued together with epoxy, I'm ready to start fairing the deck in preparation for fiberglass. So I think we're going to leave the episode there. Next episode we'll pick up with all the fairing of this deck, nice and smooth as possible, and then getting into fiberglassing and removing the deck so that we can work on cockpit, hatches, and the insides. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hey, do consider maybe giving me a thumbs up like on the button below, or even hit the subscribe button and follow along with this build and the other builds that are going on in the shop.